Well, it is very special for me and Robin to be here with you all today. The approximately 3.5 years that I served this congregation was a special and interesting time for all of us. When I agreed to be interim part-time pastor in February 2019, only God knew that almost 14 months later, we would be in the throes of COVID as we sought to navigate uncharted waters together. I remember thinking as COVID morphed and changed through the months and years that perhaps those challenges were preparing us for something else, something worse. That something else might be what we are facing today as the crisis in the Middle East has agitated much of the world. Ever since the devilish attack by Hamas in the south of Israel on October the 7th, I've been mulling over the dynamics of connections. This began with seeing how our own kids, and in case you're not aware, we have 10 of them, ages 20 to 42. It's been something to see how affected they've all been by what happened that day and since. For 2 of them, it helped that they were in Israel exactly a month before. In fact, their last day was at the beach in Ashdod, in an Israeli coastal town about 25 miles from the Gazan border. My daughter Naomi was saying on my podcast the other day how surreal it is to think back to when they were there among fully garbed Muslim women and their families, ultra-Orthodox Jewish families, and not-so-religious bikini-clad women. They were all peacefully coexisting, and then Naomi was thinking about how exactly 1 month later that peace was shattered on the very sand her feet had walked. The other daughter, it was her very first time there. When she's back in Ottawa, in light of the events of October 7th, a friend said to her, just very shortly after it happened, the friend said, "I'm sure you're glad you aren't there now." How do you answer that? It's like coming home to discover that your family has all been murdered and somebody says, "I'm sure you're glad you weren't home when that happened." Upon hearing such an illustration that I just shared, somebody might react with, "Oh, I didn't know you had family there." Well, yeah, we do. About 7 million family members. Perhaps it sounds strange that I would feel that connected to our people so far away. Well, if we didn't feel that way on October 7th, we sure did the Friday after, the day that Hamas called for a day of rage against all Jewish people everywhere. Not Israelis, Jews. That's us. Except we didn't have to wait that long to feel that connection. We already knew that as Israel goes, so does the whole Jewish world. So we feel connected, as do some of our Christian friends. And I mean some, not most. You might know about our son Joshua's article he wrote almost a week after October 7th, which is entitled, "Why You Might Have Lost Your Jewish Friends This Week and Didn't Even Know About It." He wrote it just to get some thoughts off his chest. The idea was that we Jews live in a world, as Jewish, whether we believe in Yeshua, Jesus the Messiah or not, we Jews live in a world with an ongoing angst, wondering what non-Jews actually think of us. And among the nicer folks, many of them Christians, what would they do if, God forbid, there was another Holocaust? Would you hide us? How then, after October 7th, Josh wondered, are we to interpret your silence? Almost immediately he began to receive apologies from friends. We get it. People don't know what to say. They're confused by all the news reports. They don't understand the connection we feel. They don't understand the existential threat we face. So Josh said what needed to be said, and some friends apologized, then strangers, and among them Christians and other non-Jews. And then his article got the attention of the Jewish world. One person from New York City commented, "Thank you so much for this. I've seen a number of excellent open letters to my non-Jewish friends, but something was always missing. This," meaning his article. Another person, also from New York, but originally from Jerusalem, wrote, You put my life in words. So grateful. It was even reposted by the former chief rabbi of Vienna, as well as a major Israeli news agency. And then Warren Kinsella, a long-time Canadian political staffer and journalist, not Jewish, was so moved by Josh's article that he wrote a piece in the Ottawa Sun encouraging all people everywhere to read Josh's article. To see how God used my son, a Jewish believer, follower of Jesus, living in Arizona currently, where he's a worship leader at a Calvary chapel, to express the heart of Jewish people everywhere in the aftermath of our greatest single-day disaster since the Holocaust, I have no words. And speaking of connection, the irony of it being a Jewish follower of Jesus speaking for Jewish people everywhere, when so many Jews and non-Jews, Christians included, regard us, Jewish believers in Jesus, as outsiders, not really genuine Jews, the irony is striking. But why should we, Messianic Jews, Jewish followers of Jesus, be viewed as other, not really Jewish? Hitler didn't. He couldn't care less about the Jewish people as a religious community. He understood that we are a people group, whatever our beliefs. This is a case where he was actually aligned with a biblical perspective. When God established his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants, he set us apart forever. So whether we feel that connection or not, whether others acknowledge it or not, it's a real thing. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, not only affirms this ancient connection, he expands it beyond ourselves. Yet how he does so has been misrepresented to the extent that it's been undermined. Through church history, the God-given connection between Jew and Gentile and Jesus has been so severed to a point that's just about, but not quite, beyond repair. I've been giving a lot of thought, more than usual lately, to Paul's brilliant illustration of the olive tree in Romans chapter 11. If you saw my presentation 2 weeks ago on Israel and the faithfulness of God, I focused on it somewhat. This morning, I would like to look at it more closely. Before I do, I want to mention that I actually spoke on Romans 11 as the basis of my final sermon here as pastor on April 24th, 2022. It was called God's Heart for Israel, and it was similar in theme to the much more involved presentation I did a couple of weeks ago. The basis thesis of that is how failing to understand God's ongoing faithfulness to the literal people of Israel undermines a biblical understanding of God's faithfulness to everyone. Along with this is what I believe is the church's responsibility to reflect God's faithfulness to the Jewish people, which will eventually result in Israel's full restoration to God through the Messiah. But today, there is something about the olive tree illustration itself that I want to explore with you in relation to the topic of connection. So let's read Romans 11, verses 11 to 32, and then we'll work through it, and I'll make comments as I go along. So Romans 11, starting at verse 11. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now, I am speaking to you Gentiles, non-Jews. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it's not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off, so that I might be grafted in. That's true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then this kindness and severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you are cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. So let's go back to verses 11 and 12. Paul writes, so I ask, did they stumble in order that they may fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? I included this part of Romans 11 to show how Paul introduces his olive tree illustration. There's no real introduction to it. He just starts talking about it. And I do mean talking. I've been spending quite a bit of time in my own personal study in Paul's letters. And as a Bible college graduate, I should have known this, but I never really took it seriously. And that is how Paul's letters were dictated. And they read that way, with long sentences, and he'll cut himself off and go down a bit of a bunny trail, maybe returning to his main thought. This is not to diminish in any way the brilliance of his letters. Not at all. They are phenomenal. They are clearly inspired by God, but they don't read like theological textbooks. Rather, they are passionate, vivid, highly directive, inspired illuminations of God's truth for all time. So back to the passage. Paul was making a case that even though the majority of his people, the Jewish people, were not receptive to the message of the gospel, God had not rejected them as a people. In fact, he asserts that whether the people of Israel are faithful to God or not, God still uses them for his purposes. Read verses 13 to 16. Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles. I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. Paul makes a big deal out of his ministry, partly to get his people's attention. The make my fellow Jews jealous may have to do with the correct understanding in the Jewish world of the time that through them blessing would come to the whole world. Paul seemed to think that his success among non-Jews through the gospel would provoke his own people to jealousy. While the success may bug some, others would realize that the power of God was actually with Paul and his message. Paul illustrates God's ongoing faithfulness to Israel with two pictures. The first refers to a Jewish temple ceremony, a form of which is still followed today. When bread was being prepared, a portion of dough would be removed from the batch and burned as a sacrifice. The sacrifice of the portion set apart the whole batch as holy. By the way, that's a principle that I like to apply to tithing. When we give to God a portion of our income, we are declaring that everything we have belongs to him. But back to the dough. Oh, tithing, dough. Sorry, that's just a kind of a pun that I wasn't intending. Okay, back to the squishy-wishy dough, bread dough. Paul is either referring to Jesus as the sacrificial portion or the early Jewish believers, whereby the representative few, like Paul, set apart the whole as holy unto God. Therefore, due to the great Israelite Jesus or the minority of faithful Israelites in Paul's day, Israel remains set apart for God's purposes. So whether individual Jewish people serve God or not, God continues to use them, us, as a people to fulfill his purposes. The second illustration, the olive tree, is explained in far more detail than the dough. As we read, Paul says, if the root is holy, so are the branches. This means that the status of the branches are based upon the status of the root. This makes sense, as the health of a tree's branches is dependent on the health of the root system. Paul may be making an allusion to Isaiah chapter 6. It doesn't actually talk about roots, but you'll see. Isaiah chapter 6 is his great vision of God on his throne, while the heavenly creatures proclaim, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. It's at this time that Isaiah is given his mission that will sadly result in people's hearts getting harder and harder, leading to a destruction that is just about total. And this is emphasized at the end of the chapter, Isaiah 6:13. We read, and though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it's felled. The holy seed is its stump. And so Isaiah is seeing how God's going to judge the people of Israel of his day and whittle them down, so to speak, till just about nothing. But the reminder is there that whatever is left is still holy unto the Lord. For Paul, we don't know for sure if the holy root upon which the branches are dependent is God, Jesus, or the patriarchs. But given all that's going on here, it's most likely to be the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for they are the foundation of God's plans and purposes in the world. All that God has done is rooted in his initial unconditional promises to them. It makes sense to understand the people of Israel as the branches that have grown out of their holy forefathers. From there, Paul elaborates on the olive tree picture to describe what is happening in his own day. Verses 17 and 18. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, don't be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it's not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. The picture here is that some branches were broken off to make room for wild branches to be grafted in. As you may know, grafting is when branches from one tree are attached to the root of another tree. This corresponds to how the majority of Jewish people in Paul's day were rejecting the message of the gospel, while some non-Jews were accepting it. His warning is that while this is the case, the wild non-Jewish branches should not respond with arrogance, as if God has a new best friend. Something like, he likes me now, chump, kind of attitude. No. That's because your place in the tree is completely dependent on the root. Verses 19 and 20. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That's true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. You could see how some may think in terms of others were gotten rid of in favor of you. But that's not what's going on here. This is about faith, something Paul thoroughly explains earlier in Romans. Finding right relationship with God on the basis of simply trusting in him is nothing to boast about. Instead, we are to be grateful to be included on the basis of God's grace in our lives. In fact, in verse 21 we read, For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. He's saying if God is being severe with the natural branches of the tree, how much more will he be severe with the foreign ones? I don't think I've ever heard that preached. Verse 22. Note then the kindness and severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, Paul writes, you too will be cut off. Ouch! Now that's something to consider. Verses 23 and 24. And even they, that's the natural Jewish branches, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what by nature is a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? This is to say, don't assume that God is finished with Israel. The principle that allows non-Jews to be grafted into the olive tree makes it clear that the cut-off branches can easily be grafted back into the tree. In fact, this is exactly what will happen. Jesus anticipated this as he grieved over Israel's unbelief days before his crucifixion when he said in Matthew 23, verses 37 to 39, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing? See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Paul affirms this, continuing where we left off in Romans 11, verses 25 to 27. "Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way all Israel will be saved, as it is written, 'The deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins.'" The hardening of Israel that resulted in the opening of the gospel door to the nations, this hardening is both partial and temporary. It's partial in that despite general Jewish rejection of the gospel, there's always been a minority, a remnant, sometimes quite small, sometimes more substantial, among the Jewish people who believe. And it's also temporary. It's temporary in that the day is coming when all Israel will be saved. In case there's any doubt that he means literal ethnic Israel, the Jewish people in other words, Paul makes that clear by referencing Isaiah 59, 20 to 21. "The deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob." By mentioning Jacob, it's clear this is not some sort of spiritual Israel, but the actual one that began with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what's the point? Here's the point. The tree into which non-Jewish believers have been incorporated is Israel's tree. The tree isn't Israel. The tree is better defined as God's plans and purposes throughout history. However, those plans and purposes are deeply rooted in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and have been developed in and through their natural descendants over time. According to Romans 11:24 that we read already, Israel still lays claim to that tree. Let me quote it again. "For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree?" Paul is clear that whether through the Jewish people's cooperation or not, God uses them in particular ways. And one day, that will culminate in their full restoration in their Messiah, the Lord Jesus, which in turn is related to the restoration of all things. Therefore, it's reasonable to claim that while the church is not Israel, it's far more connected to Israel, to its people, to its history, and to its destiny than it has tended to think for the past 2,000 years. Paul likely was thinking of the God-established connection between non-Jewish Jesus followers and the Jewish people in general when he wrote in the next section of Romans 11, verses 28 to 32, "As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. For just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too now have been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all." Paul here acknowledges the antagonism on the part of Jewish religious leadership toward the gospel. Yet at the same time, he strongly confirms God's ongoing love for them due to his commitment to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He then explains that just as God used Israel's disobedience to bring mercy to the nations, Israel's disobedience would create the opportunity for God's mercy to be extended back to them through the church. I have no idea how Paul may have envisioned how this would actually happen, how the restoration of Israel in the Messiah through the church would occur. What we do know is that he was aware of the growing arrogance on the part of non-Jewish believers towards Jewish people, likely arrogance towards both Jewish believers and Jewish non-believers. That's why he tried to correct it. Yet I don't think he could have perceived how that arrogance would grow into extreme disdain for anything Jewish. He also didn't know that the church would eventually become intertwined with Rome and the other political powers of Europe, and together they would enforce horrible anti-Jewish policies, just about completely severing the God-given connection between Israel and the church. I say just about for two reasons. First, there have been odd ones here and there who have somehow were not infected by the anti-Jewish rhetoric that's been part and parcel of the church for centuries. And second, God has not allowed that connection to be completely severed. Now, my impression is that many, if not most, Christians are not aware of the anti-Jewish doctrines, policies, and activities that have marked church history. But we won't be able to experience the kind of connection that's reflected in Paul's olive tree illustration if we don't deal with these things. Christian anti-Jewish sentiment has been largely undergirded by the charge of deicide, the idea that all Jews of all time and for all time collectively bear the guilt of killing Jesus, an idea that began in the 2nd century and has fueled anti-Jewish sentiments to this day. To this day. See, I don't know what would happen if I did a poll of the churches of Ottawa asking who killed Jesus. I wonder how many people would give the correct biblical answer as articulated by the apostles when they met for prayer after Peter and John's brief imprisonment in Acts chapter 2, verses 27-28, when they asserted, this is supposed to be Acts chapter 4, made a mistake. Acts chapter 4, verses 27-28. This is what was in their prayer. "For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place." So the correct answer to the question, who killed Jesus, is therefore everyone. And yet, to this day, I would say the majority of people in the church worldwide, the Jews are still regarded as the villains of the gospel story. The church has tended to fail to see that as the chosen people, they, or we, because being Jewish myself, we were called, without our permission, to demonstrate to the world what happens when God sets you apart, which is not only in acting like everyone else, failing big time to live up to God's standards, but also to have our failings written down in a book for everyone to read forever. And then the predominantly non-Jewish church, instead of responding with humility and respect, sought to distance itself from its Jewish roots. And if only it was only distancing itself, That would have been a lot better than the misrepresentations and persecutions endured by our people for much of the last 2,000 years. This misguided, oftentimes devilish resentment and hatred eventually resulted in all sorts of anti-Jewish policies: humiliations, ghettos, crusades, inquisitions, the need to wear special clothing, not being allowed to own land or to work certain trades, pushed into the banking industry only to use that against us, unto even more resentment. Christian hatred against the Jewish people included ridding itself of any semblance of Jewishness, be it Jewish people or any perceived Jewish practice. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, famous for clarifying the nature of Jesus as equally human and divine. But most people don't know that it was also then that the date of when to celebrate Jesus' resurrection, aka Easter, was established. The council determined that it must not be celebrated at Passover time as recorded in the Bible. No, you can't do that. Here's what the emperor wrote following the council. I share it with you as it captures the church's relationship to the Jewish people at that time and beyond. This is what Constantine wrote. It was, in the first place, declared improper to follow the custom of the Jews in the celebration of this holy festival because their hands have been stained with crime. The minds of these wretched men are necessarily blinded. By rejecting their custom, we establish and hand down to succeeding ages one which is more reasonable and which has been observed ever since the day of our Lord's sufferings. Let us then have nothing in common with the Jews who are our adversaries, for we have received from our Savior another way. It was this very sentiment that would eventually lead to the Holocaust, as it was believed that the Jewish people should exist as an eternal example of what happens when you reject Jesus. As a Lutheran church, especially, if you've never read what Martin Luther said about the Jews, I encourage you to do so. Please understand, I am not picking on you. Neither am I working out my own resentment. My heart is to see the God-designed connections in the Jesus community of faith restored and flourish. And Luther, as you may well know, is not just about Lutherans. Those of us whose faith is rooted in the Reformation, as mine is, like to think that we've been untainted by ancient church abuses and misguided teaching. Sadly, this is not the case. And when it comes to Martin Luther in particular, how could it be that such a genuine hero of the faith, and I mean that, how could he speak of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in such hideous tones, such as these two examples taken from his booklet, The Jews and Their Lies? And this is just a taste. First one, Luther writes, "Be on your guard against the Jews, and know that where they have their schools, there is nothing but the devil's nest in which self-praise, vanity, lies, blasphemy, disgracing God and man are practiced in the bitterest and most poisonous way as the devils do themselves." Second example, "They are the real liars and bloodhounds who've not only perverted and falsified the entire scriptures from beginning to end and without ceasing with their interpretations. And all of the anxious sighing, longing, and hope of their hearts is directed to the time when someday they would like to deal with us heathen as they dealt with the heathen in Persia at the time of Esther. Oh, how they love that book of Esther, which so nicely agrees with their bloodthirsty, revengeful, and murderous desire and hope. The sun never did shine on a more bloodthirsty and revengeful people as they who imagine to be the people of God, who desire to and think they must murder and crush the heathen." So much for not being arrogant towards the branches. And all this along with the dominant view within the church that all the wonderful Old Testament promises to Israel about forgiveness, restoration, return to the land, and blessing overflowing to the whole world no longer belong to us. They no longer belong to us, the people of Israel, but to the church as the new or the true Israel. It wouldn't be so bad if the church also took the warnings and words of judgment as well, but nope. Ethnic Israel gets to keep all the negative stuff while the church runs away with the blessings. So I guess, speaking as a Jewish person myself, it isn't our own tree after all. Either God tricked us in that the expectations of Israel as delineated through Scripture were never for us in the first place, or he changed his mind, having originally given unconditional promises to our forefathers, only to give them away to others when we needed them the most. If it isn't clear, I do not believe that. I do believe, as Paul said, all Israel will be saved. When I look at the history of Israel and the church, I get pretty discouraged. But when I look at the Bible, I see two things. First, I see the future, and it's glorious. God will come through for his ancient covenant people, the people of Israel, the Jewish people. The road will be hard. Times like the one we're in right now shows me that it's going to be way harder than I ever expected. But still, the destination is guaranteed. All Israel will be saved. That also means that whatever happens, we as a people will be preserved. Our claim to the land of Israel is eternal, since it's rooted in the very person of God himself and sealed by the blood of the Messiah. It's one of the things I talked about in that presentation I did a couple of weeks ago, which you can see online if you haven't seen it yet. Second, besides the future, I see the present. I see the present, or I should say, I try to see the present through the lens of Scripture. I see that the essence of reality, that which really is, despite what we do, despite what we say, and despite how we feel and how I feel, that with regard to the great chasm that appears to exist separating the church from Israel, a chasm that often seems impossible to bridge, I see an olive tree. In the olive tree, I see the truth. Whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we work for it or against it, it is the God-inspired picture of the relationship of Jew and Gentile within the plans and purposes of God. By these plans and purposes, God's grace has connected us in the Messiah. We don't have to get connected to experience our God-given connection. We simply need to accept it. Once we do that, we can begin to explore it. Once we begin to explore it, that's when the real fun begins. The world is shaking, and you and I have a part to play. The church's divine connection to the people of Israel places you, places us at the center of the cosmic battle. We can ignore it. We can run away from it. We may even oppose it. Or we can embrace it and discover the great epic story into which God has drawn us.